So, things have really heated up on the U.S.-China trade front, haven't they?
They certainly have. President Trump's administration has, well, dramatically increased tariffs. We're talking 145% on most imports coming in from China.
Wow, 145%. And China, well, they didn't just sit back. They've hit back with 125% tariffs on a lot of U.S. goods.
Exactly. It's a significant escalation. Now, the White House line is that this is all about, reviving American manufacturing, bringing job
And
home.
reshoring jobs, yeah. And
Yeah.
even helping to pay for those tax cuts.
Right. But it's fair to say most economists are pretty skeptical. They really doubt that tariffs alone can actually achieve all of that.
Skeptical might be putting it mildly for some. The history isn't exactly straightforward on tariffs working like that.
No, it really isn't. They're usually complex ripple effects, things you don't always foresee.
Okay, so we're in this high-stakes situation, a real game of chicken, as some are calling it. And we're nearing another one of Trump's 100-day marks. So the big question we're tackling today is, who's actually getting the upper hand here? Who's winning?
That's the core question. We'll be digging into our sources today to look at, well, a few key things.
Like the state of negotiations or maybe the lack thereof.
Exactly. And the impact we're already seeing on U.S. exports, thinking specifically about things like soybeans and energy.
And then the flip side, right? What does this mean for imports coming into the U.S. and the prices you might end up paying?
Precisely.
Yeah.
We'll touch on what the big retailers are saying.
Yeah.
And also, how is China's economy weathering this? What's their perspective?
Plus the wider picture geopolitical ripples and even the domestic political angle for Trump.
It's a lot to unpack.
Okay, let's start with those negotiations. Because the picture there seems, well, murky, contradictory even.
That's a good way to put it. You have President Trump sounding quite optimistic, suggesting a deal is close, talking about significant tariff reductions maybe being on the table.
He's implied talks are ongoing, making progress.
Right. But then you get the official word from China's Ministry of Commerce, and it's starkly different.
Completely different. They flat out said no talks are happening right now.
They used pretty strong language, calling reports of progress groundless, lacking factual basis.
So a total disconnect in messaging there.
A huge disconnect. And what's interesting is China's posture. They're projecting strength, saying they won't be pressured.
But they're not slamming the door shut either.
Exactly. They're keeping the possibility of dialogue open. It feels very strategic. We also saw a report, unconfirmed by Beijing, mind you, that they might be looking at exemptions for maybe 131 specific U.S. products.
Interesting. So a little carrot alongside the stick, perhaps.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift to the actual impact. U.S. exports. What are we seeing?
Well, the soybean numbers really jump out. In that first full week right after the tariffs hit, so mid-April,
Yeah.
net sales dropped by half, 50% compared to the week before.
50%. Wow. And how much of that was the China market?
That's the key part. Exports to China, which remember was the biggest market for U.S. soybeans, they fell off a cliff, down 67%.
67%. That's huge. That's got to be hurting farmers.
Oh, absolutely. Experts like Pier Giuseppe Fortunato are warning this could hit U.S. farmers really hard. Some could potentially even go out of business.
And it's not just farmers, right? He said it affects anyone tied to China.
Yeah, his point is the strain extends across all sectors that have significant exposure to the Chinese market.
Which includes energy too, doesn't it? We send a lot of oil, gas, coal over there.
We do. In 2023, it was around $15 billion worth, losing a chunk of that market. That would definitely sting U.S. energy firms.
Okay, so clear impacts on the export side. What about the other way? Imports into the U.S. and what that means for, well, us, the consumers.
Right. We're seeing some early indicators there, too. Freight bookings, basically, reserving space on ships coming from China to the U.S. Those were down significantly in April.
How much are we talking?
Reports vary, but somewhere in the range of 30 to maybe even 60% down.
So fewer goods being shipped now.
It means fewer goods arriving later. There's a lag time, of course. You won't see empty shelves immediately.
But when retailers need to restock, that's when the problems could show up.
That's the concern. And you're hearing it directly from the big players, like Walmart and Target. They've actually gone public warning about potential empty shelves and higher prices.
When might we see that?
They're suggesting maybe as early as next month.
Yeah.
And they've even raised concerns about supply chain issues potentially lasting through Christmas.
Oof, Christmas shopping season. That's not good. What kind of products are most affected?
Well, think about what we import a lot of from China. Electronics are huge, something like 46% of electronic appliances back in 2022.
Okay.
Clothing, obviously. And even things people don't always think about, like Ingredients for pharmaceuticals.
Right, the active ingredients often come from China or India, so prices for all those things are likely going up.
That's the expectation. And it's not just anecdotal. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, they've actually revised their U.S. inflation forecast for 2025.
Upwards, I assume?
Yep,
Oh,
up to 3%.
yeah.
And they specifically cited the tariffs as the reason for a full 1 percentage point of that increase.
1% just from the tariffs. Wow.
And it doesn't stop there. They also lowered their forecast for U.S. economic growth and significantly raised the odds of a U.S. recession this year.
So higher inflation, slower growth, maybe even recession. That's not a great outlook. How's China handling all this pressure then?
It's complex. I mean, the U.S. did import a huge amount from China last year. Was it $439 billion roughly?
Yeah, something like that.
Which sounds massive. And it is, but you have to put it in perspective. It's still only about maybe 3% of China's total economy.
Okay, so significant, but maybe not crippling on its own, though their economy is still pretty export-focused, right?
It is. It relies heavily on exports. And forecasts like the one from Goldman Sachs suggest these tariffs could drag down China's GDP growth, potentially by as much as 2.4 percentage points.
That's a noticeable hit.
It would be. But the official line from Beijing is one of, well, confidence. They keep saying they'll hit their 5% growth target.
And they claim they can manage without U.S. farm goods and energy.
They argue they can replace U.S. imports by buying from other countries or boosting their own domestic production.
We saw that quote from Zhao Qingxin, right? Basically saying, even if U.S. grain and energy imports stopped entirely, China's supply wouldn't be significantly impacted.
Exactly. It projects this image of self-sufficiency. And look, there's some truth to the idea that China's been preparing for something like this.
How so?
Well, experts point out they started diversifying away from U.S. imports back during the first Trump trade war in 2018. Shifting suppliers.
Planning ahead.
Seems like it. Plus, China has significant leverage in areas like critical minerals. The U.S. depends heavily on China for those up to 60% for some key ones.
And China doesn't rely on the U.S. for similar critical stuff.
Not nearly to the same extent. It's an asymmetry. Think of it like the U.S. needs a specific ingredient. Only China reliably sells in bulk, but China can get its ingredients from lots of places.
That gives them a strong card to play. Okay, what about the wider world? Geopolitics. Trump wants allies involved, right?
Yeah, the idea seems to be to get allies like the EU, UK, Japan on board, maybe through new trade deals, maybe by asking them to pull back from China economically.
As a condition for avoiding U.S. tariffs themselves.
Potentially. But so far, the allies seem hesitant, reluctant even.
They're not jumping to join an economic fight with China.
Doesn't look like it.
Yeah.
The European Commission explicitly said they don't want decoupling, basically, cutting ties.
And the UK.
Their chancellor also stressed the need to engage with China's massive economy. They don't seem keen on confrontation.
And I guess that makes sense if you look at trade flows. Lots of countries depend on China, right?
Hugely. Not just the EU, but developing nations, too. Bangladesh, Cambodia, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia. They rely on China for cheap consumer goods and for parts needed in their own industries.
So asking them to hurt their own economies just to help the U.S. trade deficit, that's a tough sell.
A very tough sell. It's hard to see them undermining their own interests like that.
Okay, final piece. Domestic politics here in the U.S. This must play differently here than in China.
Absolutely. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party doesn't have to worry about midterms or presidential elections in the same way.
Right. But the Republican Party certainly does.
Exactly. And if this trade war drags on and starts hitting American consumers and businesses harder, well, that could have real political costs.
Trump's approval ratings could take a hit, especially if inflation keeps rising because of this.
It's a definite risk. Remember that 1% inflation jump we talked about? That's money out of your pocket at the checkout. It hits people directly.
And that could impact elections. The House majority is already razor thin.
Very thin. Continued economic pain, blamed on the trade war, could certainly jeopardize the Republican hold on the House, maybe even affect Senate races.
So all these factors, the economic impact, the political risks, they probably contribute to China feeling less rushed to make a deal.
It seems likely. It suggests the pressure to find a resolution might actually be mounting more on the U.S. side, on the Trump administration.
So wrapping this up, it's a really messy picture, isn't it? Conflicting signals on talks, real pain for U.S. exporters, warnings about costs for you, the consumer.
China projecting resilience, but facing potential economic headwinds, allies staying on the sidelines. It's incredibly uncertain how this plays out.
Yeah. The core tension seems clear. Trump's aggressive tariff strategy versus China's determined pushback and maybe a longer-term game plan.
That sums it up pretty well.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener. Given how tangled up the global economy is and all these conflicting pressures and viewpoints we've discussed, what are the really lasting changes we might see emerge from this? How could this US China conflict permanently reshape global trade, and who ultimately holds the economic power down the road?
That's the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it? Lots to think about there.